The morning they came for her keys, Odessa Halverson had just finished folding the last of her late husband's shirts. She had been doing it for 5 years now, opening the cedar closet just to breathe in what was left of him, refolding sleeves that had long since been folded by her own careful hands, telling herself that tomorrow would be the day she finally put everything into a box. Tomorrow had never come. The shirts were still there on the shelf, and so was she, in the narrow red brick townhouse on the east end of Portland, where Theo had carried her across the threshold in 1972 and promised her forever. Forever had lasted 47 years. The 5 after that had been hers alone to carry, and she had carried them without complaint, because that was what her mother, Geraldine, had taught her, that a woman's life is measured not by what she is given, but by how she bears what is taken. She was 79 that morning. Her hair, once the color of strong coffee, had gone the shade of mourning doves. Her hands, still capable, were mottled now with the small brown freckles of a long life. She wore a pale gray cardigan buttoned at her throat, and a navy house dress printed with small white anemones, and she had made herself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat down at the scarred oak table in the small square kitchen where she had eaten 47 years of breakfasts, not knowing, not imagining, that her life was about to break in half before the kettle had cooled. The doorbell rang at 9:14 a.m. She heard the brass knocker after it, the sharp, impatient taps of someone who did not intend to wait. Through the peephole she saw Preston, her stepson, in a navy suit and no tie, his jaw set hard, and beside him, Yvette with her sleek chestnut hair blown smooth and her camel coat perfectly buttoned. In Yvette's gloved hand was a manila envelope. Odessa's hand trembled slightly as she drew back the bolt. Preston did not wait to be invited. He stepped into the narrow hallway and stood on the threadbare Persian runner and looked around the way an appraiser looks around a house he has already decided to sell. "Odessa," he said, and she noticed at once that he no longer called her any of the softer names. Not Desi, not Mom, not even the cool Mrs. Halverson he had used in the early years when her husband was still alive to require politeness. Just the bare first name, emptied of warmth. "We have to talk," Yvette said. Her voice had the practiced softness of someone who had rehearsed a difficult conversation in her car. "Maybe we should sit down." They sat in the front parlor. Odessa arranged the tea tray from habit. Preston did not touch the tea. Yvette placed the envelope on the low table between them and folded her hands. "There is no gentle way to say this," Preston began, and already Odessa understood that whatever was coming had been settled for weeks before she had been given a chance to understand. "Dad's estate has been closed for 8 months now. The Portland market has peaked. I've had the townhouse on the books at a private offer from a buyer in Boston. The closing is in 48 hours. The room was very quiet. Odessa heard the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of a seagull over the harbor. "The closing," she said at last. "The closing on what?" "The house," Preston said. "This house." Odessa set down her teacup. She felt the warm saucer tremble against the ring of cold china beneath it. "Preston," she said, "Theo bought this house before I married him. We lived in it for 47 years. This is my home." Yvette slid the envelope across the low table and opened it slowly with the manicured delicacy of someone delivering unpleasant news on silver. "The house was in your late husband's name alone," she said, "which we confirmed at the estate filing. After his passing, title passed to his estate, and from the estate to Preston, as the sole heir under the trust that your husband established in 1984. Odessa stared at the papers. She read the grantor line. She read the grantee line. She read the name of her stepson in black ink. "But I was his wife," she said softly, more to the heir than to either of them. "I was his wife for 47 years. "You were never added to the deed," Preston said. "That's not anyone's fault. It's just the record. Dad set up the trust before he married you, and under the terms, everything flowed to me." He paused, and his voice softened slightly, the first wash of pity he had permitted himself. And Odessa found the pity worse than the coldness. "Yvette and I have spoken with a relocation counselor. There are very nice assisted living facilities in the greater Portland area. Some of them have financial assistance for widows. We can help you with the application paperwork. It will be a softer adjustment than you think." 48 hours, Odessa repeated, as if she needed to hear her own mouth say it to believe it. "You have to be out by Friday at 5. The words did not feel real. They lay on the table between her cup and Preston's untouched tea like 3 white stones. She did not shout. She did not weep. She only rose slowly, because her knees had gone uncertain, and walked past Yvette's folded hands, past Preston's impatient jaw, past 47 years of framed photographs climbing the staircase wall, and stood at the narrow window that looked out onto the tiny brick courtyard where she had planted hydrangeas the first summer of her marriage. "I will pack," she said finally, without turning. "You may leave the papers on the table. I will be out by Friday." They left. She stood at the window a long time. The seagulls wheeled, the tea cooled. Somewhere in the silence between what her life had been and what it was about to become, Odessa Halverson felt the floor of the world give way beneath her like a sheet of river ice. She did not weep then. She wept later, alone in the kitchen, with the cold chamomile in her cup and the fold of the last shirt still creased along her forearm. She wept for Theo, who had always promised he would take care of her, and who had left the paperwork undone. Because men of his generation had believed that love was a kind of insurance, and had not always understood that institutions do not recognize love, only ink. She wept for herself, and for the woman she had been at 24 in a borrowed white dress, and for every year between. And then, because her mother Geraldine had taught her that tears water the soil but do not plow it, she wiped her face with the hem of her apron and rose to begin. There was very little that felt like hers. She walked from room to room with a laundry basket and sorted the objects of 47 years into categories of memory and weight. The wedding china she had chosen at Bloomingdale's in 1972, too heavy to carry, too bound to a life she could no longer live in, she left them in the cabinet. The silver service her mother-in-law had given her, Preston's by inheritance, not hers. The photographs she took down from the staircase wall one by one, wrapping each in tissue, and placed them in the suitcase. Theo's reading glasses, the small silver locket with her mother's hair coiled inside, the wool afghan her grandmother had crocheted when Odessa was a girl, a dog-eared copy of Rilke's Book of Hours that had traveled with her since college, a worn cookbook with her mother's handwriting in the margins, 2 cardigans, 3 dresses, stockings, undergarments, the plain pearl earrings Theo had given her on their 40th anniversary. It all fit, she realized, in a single vintage tan leather suitcase with brass corner caps. 47 years of a life reduced to what 2 hands could still manage. She was nearly finished when she remembered the desk, Theo's desk, a narrow mahogany secretary in the corner of their bedroom that she had not opened in the 5 years since his passing, because some griefs are too private to rummage. She knelt before it now and pressed the brass lock, and the front folded down with a soft sigh of old hinges. The cubby holes inside were full of him, his spectacles case, a bundle of his boyhood letters, a small jar of typewriter ribbon spools, a gold lapel pin from his college fraternity, and in the narrow-bottomed drawer beneath a folded handkerchief her hand found the small, cool shape of a key. It was a brass key, the color of honey, old, heavy in her palm, and attached to its ring by a short loop of frayed twine was a paper tag, brown-edged with age. She held it up to the lamp. The ink was faded but legible in her husband's square, careful hand. Mother's Cottage, Willow Hollow. For when there is nothing left. Odessa did not cry. She did not breathe. She sat on the rug with the key in her palm and felt the weight of a door she had not known was hers open in her chest. Mother's cottage. Her mother, Geraldine's stone cottage in the small Vermont hamlet where Geraldine had grown up, where Odessa had spent half her summers as a girl, where her mother had returned to spend her last years and had died 31 years ago of a quiet heart. Odessa had assumed, they had all assumed, Theo had assumed, that after the funeral the cottage had passed to Geraldine's brother or had reverted to the town for taxes or had simply settled under a slow shroud of forest and been forgotten. No one had gone back, no one had asked. And here now, in Theo's desk, was a key and a note in his hand that she had never seen, written in a voice she had never heard him use with her in life. For when there is nothing left. She closed her fingers around the key. "You knew," she whispered to the empty room. "Theo, you knew all along." She did not sleep that night. She packed the key into the inside pocket of her cardigan where the silver locket rested. And in the morning she took a Greyhound bus from the Portland Terminal west across the long, pale November country. The leaves of the maples had fallen. The fields lay the color of old brass. She had a window seat beside a young mother whose toddler slept against his car seat with his small hand curled like a new leaf. Odessa watched the hills pass. She thought of her mother, Geraldine's voice, deep and slow, and always a little amused, saying in the summer kitchens of her childhood, "A woman who has nothing still has everything she was born with. She has her 2 good hands, she has her 2 good feet, she has her wit, and she has whatever she can still remember of her mother. That is usually enough. It is always enough." She rode the bus for 5 hours. She changed at White River Junction. She rode a smaller local bus for an hour more. The hamlet of Willow Hollow lay at the end of a narrow gravel county road that forked off the paved highway without a sign. She had had to ask the driver to stop. And as she stepped down with her suitcase into the cold, clean November air, she smelled wood smoke and wet leaves and the slight mineral tang of a nearby brook. And she knew before she had walked a single pace that she had come back to a country that remembered her. The main street of Willow Hollow held perhaps 12 buildings, a white clapboard church with a slate roof, a small general store with a covered porch, a cafe with a hand-painted sign that read Inez's, a hardware, a shuttered bank. Odessa walked into Inez's with her suitcase and sat at a small round table near the window, and a broad-shouldered woman in a flour-dusted apron came out from the back and looked at her with the steady, frank evaluation of a country woman meeting an unfamiliar traveler. "Coffee, honey?" the woman asked. Her voice was warm, low, with the faint rolling music of the Spanish she had spoken before English. "Yes, please," Odessa said, "with cream if you have it." The coffee came, and with it a slice of buttered cornbread Odessa had not asked for. "You looking for a room, honey?" "I am looking for a cottage," Odessa said. She took the brass key from her cardigan and laid it on the table between them. This cottage. The cafe owner, her name Odessa would learn, was Inez Velasco, and her cafe would become a second kitchen in the weeks to come. Picked up the tag and held it to the window light. "Halverson," she said slowly, and her face softened. "You are Geraldine's daughter." Odessa felt something in her chest loosen that had been held tight for 800 miles. "You knew my mother." "Everyone in this town knew your mother," Inez said, "and everyone who knew her loved her." The cottage is up the lane past the church, the last driveway on the left before the road goes to gravel. It sits back in the trees. "Nobody has been up there in a long time, sweetheart. Are you sure you want to go up there alone?" "I am sure." "Let me send Elmer with you, at least, to help with the door. The door will be swollen." Elmer Kowalski, when Inez brought him out of the back where he had been drinking a second cup, was a wiry man of about 80 in a faded red flannel shirt and a battered brown felt hat, and he looked at Odessa's face for a long moment and then nodded once, as though a debt long carried had finally come due. "Geraldine was a good woman," he said. I fixed her roof the summer of 1991. Your mother paid me in jars of raspberry jam and told me stories about you. Let me carry that suitcase for you." They walked together up the lane. The afternoon sun came low and slantwise through the pines, amber on the gravel, amber on the tall, dead goldenrod at the verges, amber on the wild asters that still held their color in sheltered places. And as they rounded the last curve, Odessa saw the cottage for the first time in 31 years, and the breath went out of her. It was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was larger. Perhaps she had grown around it, the way a tree grows around an iron fence, carrying the shape of it inside her, without knowing. The fieldstone walls were the same soft grays and warm ochres. Ivy climbed the south face of the chimney. Moss lay heavy across the slate roof. And the heavy oak front door with its iron strap hinges was the same door through which her mother had carried her out as an infant, through which Geraldine had waved her off to school, through which Odessa herself had once slammed in a girl's temper at 13 and been called back by her mother's patient voice to close it properly. Elmer set down her suitcase on the low stone step, worn concave in the center by a century of use. "Your mother's boots wore that step," he said softly. "My grandmother's before her. Older than that, probably. Try your key, Mrs. Halverson." The key turned. It did not turn easily. There was a long pause of iron, remembering iron, but it turned, and the bolt slid back with a sound like a small sigh, and the heavy door swung inward on its strap hinges, and the cool scent of old lavender and old paper and long undisturbed stone rose up around them like a room that had been waiting for exactly this hour. "I will leave you now," Elmer said. "I am 3 houses up the lane, the yellow mailbox. If anything breaks or anything scares you, any time, day or night, you come to my door. Your mother was a dear friend to me. You are welcome here." She thanked him, and he went. And Odessa Halverson stepped alone into her mother's cottage for the first time in 31 years. The dust sheets over the furniture had fallen in soft, ghostly drifts. A wren had built a nest in the flue of the fieldstone hearth and long abandoned it. The horsehair settee was draped with a faded patchwork quilt in the colors of apples and cream. The writing desk under the east window held a blue china cup still half full of tea that had evaporated decades ago to a dark ring. On the mantel, beneath a layer of soft gray dust, stood a line of framed photographs that made Odessa's throat go still. Her mother, Geraldine, on her wedding day. Her mother holding Odessa as an infant in a lace christening gown. Her mother at 50, laughing, her head thrown back. Her mother at 70, in the high-collared cream blouse and long gray skirt she always wore to tea, looking out through the east window of this very room with the serene patience of a woman who had already laid all her plans and was waiting for the appointed hour. Odessa walked slowly, trailing her hand along the furniture. She drew back a dust sheet and found her mother's roll-top desk, still smelling faintly of beeswax. She drew back another, and found the narrow iron bedstead in the small bedroom off the main room, with a white coverlet folded neatly at the foot. In the kitchen nook she found the cast-iron cook stove cold, but clean, the enamel basin dry, and on the shelf above the basin, a row of blue and white jars labeled in her mother's hand, chamomile, rose hips, lemon balm. She stood with her hand on the nearest jar and felt, for the first time in 48 hours, the faintest warming of something that was not grief. That first night she slept on the horsehair settee under her grandmother's crocheted afghan, with her mother's faded patchwork quilt spread over her knees, and she slept without dreaming for the first time in 5 years. In the morning she rose before the light. She found kindling in the wood box by the hearth and a tin of long kitchen matches, and she laid a small fire for warmth and set water to boil in the blue enamel kettle. The cottage at dawn was lit by a soft pearl gray that came through the east window and turned the dust motes in the air into slow-falling stars. She made tea. She sat at the small oak table. She opened her suitcase and took out the small silver locket and laid it on the table beside her cup, and she said, out loud, because there was no one to hear her, and because she needed to hear herself, "I am 79 years old, and I have come home." And then she began. She went room by room, and she lifted the dust sheets, and she wiped the surfaces with a soft cloth, and she took her time, because a house kept by the dead must be entered as carefully as a sleeper must be woken, a little at a time, with courtesy. She found things she had forgotten. She found her mother's cedar sewing box with a thimble still inside. She found a stack of children's watercolor paintings tied with faded twine and recognized her own 7-year-old hand. She found Geraldine's garden journal, a thick leather-bound book in which her mother had recorded in her small, neat script every seed planted and every harvest brought in for 40 years. She found a box of letters tied with black ribbon. She found a braid of lavender still fragrant after 3 decades. She found a silver locket identical to the one at her own throat, but empty. She did not open the pantry door until the afternoon of her 3rd day. It sat beside the field stone hearth, a narrow door of weathered oak with a single iron handle and a heavy old lock, darker than the surrounding boards, set low into the wall, as if the pantry were half in the earth. Odessa had tried the handle on her first day, and found it locked. She had assumed it would open to a small larder of tins and sacks, and had left it for later. Now, with her house in some order and her fire burning steadily, she knelt in front of the pantry door, and she took from her cardigan pocket the brass key with the faded tag, and she fit it into the iron lock, and the bolt slid back on the first turn, as though it had been waiting the full 31 years only for this hand. The door opened not onto a pantry. It opened onto a narrow flight of 8 stone steps descending into cool darkness. Odessa caught her breath. She went back to the kitchen for the kerosene lamp she had found under the basin and the long matches, and she lit the lamp, and she took it in her right hand and her cane of self-possession in her left, and she descended. The steps were old. They had been laid, she would learn later, by her great-grandfather in 1892, and the stone was smooth at the center from generations of footfall. At the bottom, the lamplight opened into a chamber, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with fieldstone walls and a low plank ceiling, and the air was cool and dry and smelled of cedar and slate and thyme. Against the left-hand wall stood wooden shelves, and on the shelves stood ranks of mason jars, dozens of them, hundreds, still sealed, their labels in her mother's careful hand. Blackberry, 1987. Apple butter, 1989. Pickled beets, 1990. Strawberry preserves, 1992. The last jar in the topmost row read, Apple butter, September, 1993, 2 months before Geraldine's heart had stopped, and Odessa had to sit down for a moment on the stone step. Braids of dried herbs hung from a low rafter. Bags of rice and dry beans, mouse-proofed in cedar-lined tins. A small crock of lard long since dried. And against the back wall, beneath a neatly folded sailcloth, stood something Odessa had not expected. It was a wooden trunk. Low, banded in black iron, the wood dark with age and oiled many times, the hasp closed with a simple brass padlock. On the lid, burned into the wood with a hot iron in the summer of a long-ago Vermont afternoon, was a single word, Odessa. Her hand went to her mouth. The lamp trembled in her grip. She knelt slowly in front of the trunk and set the lamp on the floor beside her, and she tried the brass padlock, and the padlock opened in her hand because it had never been fully closed, only set, like a door drawn to but not latched, waiting. The lid lifted on soft leather hinges with a small, warm creak. Inside the trunk was everything she had not known she needed, and everything she had spent 79 years learning how to carry. On top, neatly folded, lay an envelope of thick cream paper with her name written across the front in her mother's unmistakable hand. To my daughter Odessa, in the hour she comes back to me. Odessa sat down fully on the stone floor. She held the envelope in her lap for a long moment before she opened it, because she knew that whatever lay inside would change her, and because she wanted to spend one more breath in the woman she had been before. Then she slid her thumb under the seal, and she drew out the letter, and she began to read. My darling girl, if you are reading this, then you have come to the cottage. I knew you would. I always knew you would. I have known it the way a mother knows the weight of the child she has carried, the way a woman who has loved deeply knows that love is not always given back to her in the same coin, but is returned always in some form and in some hour. I have set this trunk for you, my daughter, so that when the hour came, you would not have to meet it empty-handed. I have been a quiet woman most of my life. I have made jam and kept a garden and read my books and loved my daughter. But I was also my father's daughter and my grandfather's granddaughter. And I have always paid attention to the ways in which women of our family have been forgotten by the institutions of men. So I have done what my father taught me to do. I have made provision. The cottage is yours. It is not in my estate. It is not in any estate. I transferred it, in 1987, into a trust that I established in your sole name, with myself as trustee during my lifetime, and you as both remainder beneficiary and successor trustee. The papers are in this trunk, together with the original deed, together with the subsequent tax receipts, together with every record you will need. No husband of yours can claim it. No child of any husband of yours can claim it. It is yours alone, my daughter, and it has been since the autumn I buried my 7th rosebush. I have also, over the years, bought the 40 acres of woodland that border this cottage on 3 sides. I bought them a parcel at a time at the county tax sales with the small money I saved from my annuity. The deeds are also in this trunk. The timber on those 40 acres has not been cut in 80 years. A forester from Montpelier, in 1991, valued the standing timber at something over $400,000, and it has only grown since then. The deeds are titled in the same trust, not in my estate. You will need a lawyer. I have written the name of one I trusted at the bottom of this letter, though he may not be living by the time you read this. If he is not, ask Elmer Kowalski who he uses. Elmer is a good man. There is also in this trunk a smaller envelope marked Savings. I have set aside over many years the sum of $18,000 in cash. It will not buy you a new life, but it will keep you from fearing the first winter. And last, my darling girl, there is in this trunk a second envelope addressed to you in the handwriting of your husband, which he sent to me in 1989 for safekeeping against the day he might not be there to speak for you. I do not know what he wrote. I never opened it. He asked me to keep it, and I kept it. I will not pretend I was always easy about your marriage, but I will say this. Your husband, whatever his silences may have cost you, loved you well enough to write this letter and to send it here to me, to the one place he knew no court or relative could reach, so that when the hour came, you would have his voice beside mine. That says a great deal about a man. It says everything about him that matters. I love you, Odessa. I have always loved you. A mother's love does not end. It only waits. Yours, Mother. Odessa sat on the cold stone floor of her great-grandfather's root cellar, and she wept at last, not the thin, wet weeping of the first day, but a deep, quiet weeping that opened something in her chest that had been fused shut for 5 years. She wept for her mother. She wept for Theo. She wept for the young woman of 24 she had once been, and for the old woman of 79 she had become, and for the 31 years in which a cottage had stood patient in the Vermont woods and waited for her to come back to it. When she could rise, she rose. She carried the trunk's contents up to the oak table in the main room, one bundle at a time, with the slow, careful dignity of a woman carrying her own life back into her own house. The deeds, the trust papers, the tax receipts, every one of them, the envelope of cash wrapped in soft oilcloth. The second letter, in Theo's square, careful hand, sealed for 36 years, and now, at last, open to her. And on the oak table, with the fire burning and the kettle whistling and the late afternoon light coming in amber through the east window, Odessa Halverson read the second letter. It was short. It was written the autumn after Preston's mother had died, the autumn Theo had come home from the funeral of his first wife and found Odessa in the kitchen of their young marriage making soup. My dear Desi, if this letter has found you, then I have failed you in some way I cannot foresee. I have tried all my life to provide for you, and I have not always known how. I know I have not been a modern man. I know I have not always put your name on papers that should have carried it. I have trusted, wrongly it turns out, that my son would honor what I did not write down. Forgive me. I want you to know your mother's cottage was the wisest thing any woman in your family has ever done. When Geraldine told me about the trust in the last year of her life, I wept. I thanked her. I sent her this letter for you, to sit beside hers in case I was not there to help you find your way. You are the great joy of my life. Desi, the cottage is yours. It was always meant to be. Live in it. Fill it with yourself. 47 years was not enough, but it was all I was given, and I gave you all of it. Yours in every hour, Theo. She folded the letter. She pressed it to her lips. She sat a long time. The next morning she walked down the lane to Elmer Kowalski's yellow mailbox, and Elmer answered his door in his felt hat, and she said, "I need a lawyer." "I know one," Elmer said. "His name is Warren Mbeki. He is retired, but he takes a case now and again for old friends. I will drive you into Montpelier tomorrow." Warren Mbeki was a tall, slender Ghanaian-American man of 68, in a charcoal three-piece suit with a short gray beard and warm dark brown eyes behind tortoise-shell reading glasses. And when Odessa laid on his desk the trust papers and the deeds and Geraldine's letter and Theo's letter, he read them in silence for a full hour, and then he took off his glasses and polished them with his pocket square, and said, "Mrs. Halverson, I have been practicing law in Vermont for 41 years. I have rarely seen a more meticulous instrument than the one your mother drafted. Her lawyer was very good, and your mother, if I may say it, was better. The cottage is yours outright. The 40 acres of timberland are yours outright. Neither is subject to any claim of your late husband's estate, and therefore neither is subject to any claim of his son. The trust contains what we call a spendthrift clause. It cannot be reached by creditors, by in-laws, or by descendants of any husband you may have had. Your mother saw 40 years into the future with a clarity I can only call biblical. I will be honored to represent you." He helped her restore services. He helped her arrange for the forester to do a current valuation, which came back at $540,000 of standing timber, none of which needed to be cut for the cottage to generate modest annual revenue from a sustainable selective harvest. He helped her open a small local bank account. He helped her notify the town assessor that the cottage was occupied and that the tax address had changed. He asked her gently whether she wished to notify her stepson. "Not yet," Odessa said. "Let them find me in their own time. I am not running from them. I am simply not fetching them." Warren smiled. "As you prefer." The weeks that followed were the strangest and the sweetest Odessa had known. She commissioned Elmer to repair the slate roof where it had gone soft around the chimney. She had the cast-iron cook stove cleaned and refitted by a craftsman who drove up from Burlington for the afternoon. She had the chimney swept and the flue cleared of the old wren's nest. She had the windows reputtied and the oak door rehung on its iron strap hinges. She aired the patchwork quilt on the stone wall in the bright, cold November sun. She washed her mother's china with the gentle slowness of a woman handling something she had long thought lost. Inez Velasco sent up pies from the cafe, and sometimes Inez's daughter, and sometimes Elmer's wife, and sometimes people Odessa had not yet met, but who had known her mother and had been waiting, without quite knowing they were waiting, for the daughter to come home. In the second week, Dr. Noor Okafor drove up from the Vermont Historical Society in Montpelier. She had been alerted by Warren, on Odessa's authorization, that an extraordinary personal archive had come to light in a cottage above Willow Hollow. Dr. Okafor was a woman of 45 in a moss-green herringbone blazer with short, natural black hair going silver at the temples, and she walked into the cottage and stood very still in the middle of the main room, and her eyes went over the shelves of preserves and the garden journal and the 40 years of photographs and the children's watercolors and the letters tied with black ribbon, and she turned to Odessa and said, very quietly, "Mrs. Halverson, this is a museum." She offered a fellowship, a small stipend, a cataloger to come in 3 days a month, and, eventually, in 2 or 3 years, a traveling exhibit on rural women's self-documentation in the 20th century, based around Geraldine Halverson's archive, with Odessa as the curatorial consultant and author of the introductory essay. Odessa accepted. Dr. Okafor began visits every other Tuesday. Odessa, who had spent 5 years fearing that the world had forgotten her, now sat across her mother's oak table from a curator taking reverent notes about her mother's rose-hip jam labels, and the narrow room of her grief, she would later tell Inez over coffee, had opened into something with windows, and then, as she had known they eventually would, Preston and Yvette came. It was early December. The snow had fallen once, lightly, and left the hills dusted white and the pines shouldering their first powder. Odessa was sitting at the oak table with Geraldine's garden journal open in front of her, and she heard a car come up the gravel lane that had not come up in 31 years, and she set down her pencil and went to the door. Preston Driscoll in his navy suit, Yvette Driscoll in her camel coat. An envelope in Yvette's gloved hand, as before. Preston looked at the restored cottage. He looked at the new slate on the roof. He looked at the smoke rising thin and white from the repaired chimney. He looked at Odessa in a clean gray cardigan with silver hair pinned neatly at her nape, standing steady on the low stone step of her own doorway, and his pale blue eyes went through a small, silent calculation that Odessa watched on his face with a calm she had not known she possessed. "Odessa," he said. "Preston, Yvette. Good morning. Please come in. The kettle is hot." They came in. They would not take tea. Yvette sat on the horsehair settee with the patchwork quilt and held her knees together. Preston remained standing in the middle of the room. "We tracked you through the state tax records," he said. "The cottage was listed as newly occupied in the Washington County Assessor's rolls. I didn't know Dad had property up here." "He did not," Odessa said. "This cottage belonged to my mother." Preston nodded slowly. His jaw worked. "Well, I am glad you were settled. I am glad you were safe." There was a long pause. "But Odessa, I have to be frank. Dad's estate was large. Yvette and I are reviewing certain assets that were not perhaps fully accounted for at the time of probate. If this cottage was purchased with any marital funds or maintained with any marital funds, then it is technically part of the estate, and we would want to include it in the final accounting." Odessa did not answer at once. She rose. She walked to the writing desk beneath the east window. She unlocked the small drawer. She took out a neat manila folder, very slim, very orderly, and she walked back to the oak table and she set the folder down in front of Preston. "Please sit down, Preston," she said. "You will want to sit down for this." He sat. Yvette looked over his shoulder. Odessa opened the folder. "This is the trust instrument my mother executed in 1987, 12 years before your father and I were married. This is the deed conveying the cottage into that trust. This is the deed conveying the 40 acres of surrounding timberland into that trust, in parcels, between 1982 and 1988, also predating my marriage to your father. This is a current opinion letter from Warren M. Becky, Esquire, of the Vermont Bar, confirming that the trust contains a spendthrift clause and is not reachable by any creditor or relative of any spouse I have ever had. And this, she laid the last document gently on top, is a notarized letter from your father, dated October of 1989, in which he acknowledges in writing that the cottage was my mother's separate property, was to pass to me alone, and was to be honored by his heirs as lying entirely outside his estate. Preston's jaw did not move. His eyes went over the documents, and they went over them again, and slowly the blood rose and then retreated from his face. Yvette's perfect smile had collapsed into a thin, flat line. "Dad wrote this?" Preston said at last. "Your father was a better man than you ever believed him to be, Preston," Odessa said quietly. "He did love me. He did try. He did not always know how to write things down in the correct columns of the correct papers, but he tried here, and my mother tried for both of us." She closed the folder. She slid it into her lap. She looked at her stepson. She did not look away. "You may leave now, Preston. I will not pursue anything against you. I will not contest any part of your father's Portland estate. What you took in Portland you may keep. This cottage and this land are not yours. They never were. They never will be. And I would ask you now, please, to go." For a long moment, Preston did not move. Then he rose, slowly, and he picked up the envelope Yvette had brought. Whatever it contained, he did not open it, and he walked to the door. On the threshold, he stopped. He did not turn around. "I am sorry," he said, so softly Odessa almost did not hear, and then he went. Yvette followed. The car ground away down the gravel lane. Odessa stood at her doorway and watched them go, and the winter sun came low across the fields, and she felt the cottage warm at her back, and she understood for the first time in all the long, hard years since Theo had died what her mother had meant when she had said that a woman has everything she was born with. After Preston's car disappeared down the gravel lane, Odessa closed the door and stood in her kitchen and wept once, briefly, without drama. And then she put the kettle on, and she did not weep again. The thing had been named. The thing had been refused. There was nothing left of it to grieve. The days that followed had a quality she had not felt since girlhood. She woke at first light without an alarm, and she knew, without thinking, what the day required. Mondays she drove down to the general store in Inez's old farm truck. Inez had lent it to her with a set of keys and a clap on the shoulder and a quiet, "Pay me back when the snow is off." And she bought flour and dried beans and lamp oil and whatever else the pantry was short of. Tuesdays she walked the 40 acres in the tall leather boots Elmer had found for her at the surplus store in Montpelier. Wednesdays she wrote letters at the oak table to Warren M. Becky, to Dr. Okafor, to the scholarship committee at the Willow Hollow Elementary School, and she signed each one Odessa Halverson, Willow Hollow, and the address alone gave her a small satisfaction she had not expected. Thursdays Elmer came. Fridays Inez came. On Saturdays, if the roads were clear, Doctor. Okafor drove up from Montpelier with her notebooks and her white cotton gloves, and she sat at the oak table, and she unfolded one more letter from the iron-bound trunk, and she read it aloud to Odessa, and she made her careful notes. Elmer and his wife Helen, a small round woman of 76 with iron-gray braids wound around her head and blue eyes that had never stopped smiling through the 7 decades of her life in the Vermont hills, came up together on the first Thursday in December with a load of split maple firewood, and Helen brought a tin of molasses cookies and a jar of her own dill pickles, and she walked through the cottage rooms with her hand trailing along the wainscoting, and she said, "My mother-in-law quilted with your mother in 1972. I was here once as a young bride. Geraldine gave me a slice of apple cake and told me my children would be strong." She had 3 children, she said, and 9 grandchildren, and they were all strong. Odessa listened, and she felt the cottage settle around her like a garment that had been waiting its whole life to be worn. Elmer himself, she learned slowly across the Thursdays, had been a Navy electrician in the last year of the Korean War, and he had come home to Willow Hollow in 1954 and had worked 38 years at the Bartlett sawmill 6 miles down the county road, and he had rebuilt the boiler of the cottage's back wing in 1979 under Geraldine's patient supervision. He knew the bones of the building. He knew which beams were chestnut and which were hemlock, and which had been cut from the 40 acres themselves in 1883, when the Halverson great-grandfather had first broken ground for the cellar. He moved through the cottage with the unhurried confidence of a man touching a body he had known a long time, and he fixed the catch on the pantry door, and he replaced the hearthstones that had cracked in some forgotten winter, and he planed the oak table smooth where a century of elbows had worn it, dished. Inez came with her cast-iron pots and a blue enamel bowl, and in the weeks before the Christmas snows, she taught Odessa to put up applesauce from the bruised windfall apples of the cottage's 2 old orchard trees, and to bake a Mexican spice cake her grandmother had made in Guanajuato in 1923. "It is cinnamon and clove and a little black pepper," Inez said, "and it is for the cold months, and it is for loneliness that is not lonely any more. You will see." Odessa tasted the cake that first afternoon, warm from the oven with a cup of strong coffee, and she did not say anything, but her eyes filled, and Inez patted her hand and put another slice on her plate. Warren and Beckey's work with the Driscolls proceeded by letter. The first letter, sent the 3rd week of November on his Montpelier letterhead, was a single-page notice informing Preston and Yvette that the Willow Hollow cottage, the 40 acres, and all contents thereof were the legal property of Odessa Halverson, per a 1987 irrevocable trust registered in the Orange County, Vermont court, and that any further attempt to claim, represent as their own, or interfere with said property would result in immediate civil action for tortious interference and harassment, and potentially for criminal fraud, given that Preston had moved certain items out of the Portland house that had been the separate property of Odessa under the terms of Theo's 1989 notarized letter. The second letter, 2 weeks later, demanded the itemized return of 11 objects, including Theo's grandfather's railway pocket watch, a Tiffany lamp Geraldine had sent in 1991, a small rosewood writing desk that had belonged to Odessa's paternal grandmother, and a string of river pearls that had been Odessa's 75th birthday present from her sister, along with a full accounting of the jewelry Yvette had taken from the bedroom vanity. The third letter, signed in mid-January, acknowledged receipt of the objects. Preston had shipped them, 1 box at a time without a note, and closed the matter as settled. Preston did not appear again. Yvette wrote 1 letter in February, which Odessa did not open, and which she gave unopened to Warren and Beckey, who filed it in the client folder without comment. "He is finished," Warren said on the telephone the evening he sent the last letter, "and I do not expect you will hear from him again. If you do, you will call me, and you will not answer the door." Odessa thanked him. She liked the gravel of his voice across the line. She liked being spoken to as a woman with a lawyer and a cottage and a 40-acre standing timber estate. She liked the weight of what she had become. Dr. Okafor's work was slower and gentler. She sat at the oak table each Saturday with her white cotton gloves and her notebook, and she lifted 1 letter at a time from the iron-bound trunk, and she read it aloud to Odessa, and they talked about what Geraldine had meant and what the letter should say when it appeared, some years later, under museum glass in the Fellowship's public exhibit. There were letters about the Great Depression, and letters about the war, and letters about the founding of the Willow Hollow Library by 3 women in 1968, of whom Geraldine had been one. There were recipes pressed between pages of milled paper. There was a small leather ledger in Geraldine's hand, recording every dollar of the 40-acre timber income from 1962 to 1986, with the column of figures growing at the bottom of each page to the sum that had endowed the trust. "Your mother was an archivist," Dr. Okafor said one Saturday, looking up from the ledger with tears in her brown eyes. She did not use the word, but she was one. She kept. And Odessa understood in that moment that this was what mothers who loved their daughters well had done for all the generations before her. In all the small kitchens of the world they had kept. That winter was the longest and the most beautiful she had known. She kept the fire burning. She wrote the opening essay for Dr. Okafor's exhibit, in longhand at the writing desk under the east window, using the same kind of blue pen her mother had used, and she signed it with her maiden name and her married name together, because both women had brought her to this room. She had the stone walk to the front door relaid by Elmer's grandson. She planted, on the first clear day of March, 7 new rose bushes along the south wall where her mother's had been. The 8th, she planned, she would plant in April, when the ground had softened enough to take it. She invited Inez and Elmer and his wife for Sunday suppers at the oak table, and they ate her mother's apple butter from the 1993 jar with the faded label. She began slowly to answer the letters of the few friends in Portland who still wrote, and she signed her letters from the cottage and told them she was well. She was well. And when, at the thaw, a forester came up with a careful plan for a single, sustainable, selective cut that would yield her $20,000 and not break the canopy of her 40 acres, she signed the papers and used the money to endow a small scholarship at the Willow Hollow Elementary School in her mother's name, the Geraldine Halverson Award for a girl who writes. She still thought of Theo. She thought of him often. She thought of him with the clarity that only comes after a grief has been unhanded, the clarity that sees a man whole, not only the parts that failed, but also the parts that, from a hidden desk 36 years before, had reached forward in time and placed in her hand the brass key she would need for the hour she had not yet imagined. She thought sometimes of Preston, but she did not think often. She had loosed him. She did not receive him, but she did not carry him either. One bright May morning, Odessa Halverson sat at the oak table with a cup of chamomile tea and the latest notes from Dr. Okafor on the exhibit, and she looked up through the east window at the new green rising across her 40 acres, and she said aloud to the warm, quiet room, "Mother, thank you." The cottage did not answer. It did not need to. It had been answering her for 52 years already, by being there, by keeping her name in iron, on the lid of a trunk, in a stone cellar, under a door that would open only to a brass key with a faded tag, waiting patiently across 3 decades of her forgetting for the hour she would remember. And in the end, that was what she would tell the young woman from the Historical Society who came that autumn to record her oral history, that the things a mother puts away are not lost. They are kept. They wait. They open at the appointed hour. A woman who is loved well by her mother is never truly evicted from the world. She may be put out once or twice by the small institutional ink of men who did not know her, but she has a key somewhere. She has a cottage somewhere. She has 40 acres of standing timber and a trunk with her name burned into the lid and a letter that begins, "My darling girl." And when she finds them, as Odessa Halverson found them at 79, on a gold November afternoon in a hamlet at the end of a gravel lane in the Vermont hills, she will understand, as her mother Geraldine had understood for her in 1987, that a woman's second bloom is not grown from what is given to her. It is grown from what was saved for her, long before she knew she would need it, by the women who loved her most.